I'm going to introduce our speaker today. It's Zac Grisham. He is the Business and Social Sciences Librarian for Kansas State University.
Thanks for having me. As she mentioned, making sure I'm not lagging. I'm really excited to talk about a few useful resources. It's in the name, right? I'm going to be talking about using data to negotiate salary and library land. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. As she mentioned, it's this presentation workshop is broken up into a few things. First is, of course, me talking about all these resources. The second part is actually I'm going to be explaining and using the resources during the presentation, talking about them, explaining how they can be used in a variety of different ways. And then finally, we're going to end with a workshop where people actually get to use the resources and have conversations about understanding negotiation power and seeing if you have any yourself in the salaries in salary negotiation for possible jobs that you're pursuing. That being said, let's go ahead and get started, figure out how to share it properly. Here we go. All right. Can everybody, well, Kara, can we see my face using data to negotiate salary and library land, the slides?
Yes, you are good to go.
Thank you so much. All right. So, like I said, we're going to be using free resources to enhance your stance in negotiation at the national, state, local, and even individual level, figuring out how to use websites, organizations, and tools, free tools, to explore your position. The first one that I'd like to talk about is the PSEO Explorer. This is a census tool and it encompasses 30 out of the 50 states, about half of ALA accredited library programs in the United States of America. And every single year, there's more and more and more and more included. It gathers knowledge about employment trends, both geographically and industry, right? So it's going to be looking at MLIS, people who have gotten that degree, and then figuring out what industries they work in. And it helps you get a realistic understanding of salaries of course, people with the MLIS degree. Now, the reason this is important and we're not looking just at salary data is we're looking at multiple ways that we can size the job market that we're trying to be entering and giving you multiple avenues to prove your assessments, your arguments, and your narrative when you're in a salary negotiation, right? Just the more ways you can prove what you're trying to say, the easier life will get for you. That being said, let's go ahead and do a demonstration of the tool. I'm all for slides, but I think hands-on experience is a lot better. Can we see the PSO Explorer tool, Kara?
Yep, you transitioned well.
Perfect. There's some nice breaks. All right, so I've went ahead and cheated for us. I used to work in Ohio, so all of this presentation, everything I'm going to be doing is based off of if I was getting a job offer at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, just so you have an understanding of why I'm choosing zip codes, why I'm choosing states. And I thought this was useful and would be reasonable because you are all based out of Ohio. But this always defaults, right? This tool defaults to the state of Colorado. I don't know why, but that's what it does. But I've set it to where it's going to default to Ohio this time. And it looks at the earnings, and we'll talk about this one later, the flows of people with library science master's degrees. So we'll be using this later. So no need to jot down notes or be like, wow, this is really cool. You'll actually gain experience on the tool, but you can choose any of the states that are in it. You can choose any of the different universities. Now, the reason I pointed this out is to better reflect the job market. Always do all partner institutions in Ohio. If you want to brag or explore different options for MLIS degrees, like say you're a student and you want to see which one's going to have better returns or has better networks, this is a good way to do it. But understanding the markets, let's go ahead and do all partner institutions. We choose our masters, and then we go down here to choose library science, right? You might be asking, Zach, what are we looking at here? Well, this is looking at time, 1, 5, and 10, and then giving you salaries. Let's not use that right now. The easier one to understand is the percent. So what we're looking at now is because a lot of y'all, at least I was told we're targeting people newer to libraries, is going to be 1 year. But for people like me, if I wanted to assess the market, I would be looking at 5 years. And for people who are more experienced in the field and just, your Superstars, they might do the 10-year filter. I'm going to use one though for this presentation. So what we're looking at now is the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 75th percentile. What does that mean though? It means, let's say there's 100 librarians standing in a room, from lowest salary to highest salary. This is the 25th librarian. This is the 50th librarian. So right in the middle, this is like the median. And then this is going to be your 75th librarian, right? That's what they're looking at right here. And while it's cool that we have this information, something we should be thinking about is, can we prove that just because they have an MLS degree that they're actually working as a librarian? If you thought of that and you were about to ask me that question, very, very good question. How we do that is we actually do the industries and the geo flows, right? So if you look over here, it says industry. You might be asking, what is information and what is educational services? How can we prove that these are libraries? Another good question, but how do we also know if they stay in Ohio? We click this button. Now we have numbers. We go to percentage, and we have a much more useful information flow, right? We have information in educational services. Believe me, we're about to prove it, but just for this example, just understand that these are going to be your librarians or people working in libraries most likely. So we have 76%, that's a good number. And then 84% of people who work in, who have a library science degree, work in Ohio. So this right here, meaning that almost 80% are working in libraries and then 84% of people with this degree are still working in Ohio, gives these numbers right here credibility in defining the market. Not the best. I mean, some of these are actually going to be like 90% or a little bit higher, but not the worst, because you'll also find flows that are at like 20% or something like that. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out to you, this is an amazing tool. Really, really good for salary negotiation. But if the flows say only 20% of people are like within that state, instead of say, like let's say you're in California and only 20% of the people are actually staying in California, that is not a correct representation of the market, and your argument will be shot down very, very quickly because it's representing other markets. Now, to prove that this is actually in Ohio and they're the correct services, all we need to do is look at what census actually defines this stuff as. For example, we can do the industry right here. We click on this button. To all my business librarians and government librarians out there, you already know what a NAICS code is. But for those who do not, this is how the United States government and many of our resources, specifically business ones, love to classify industries. I know that sounds repetitive, but every single business in the entirety of the United States of America has to define what code they're in. So that's how we know it's good information. Information is going to be right here, 51. 80, nope, 61 is going to be down here. So we go ahead and click on it. We type in library properly, and there we go. Right? So libraries and archives, this is obviously where the people are working in our PSEO Explorer, but that's only 45%. Yeah, oh well. Yeah, 45%. So we got to figure out what the educational services one is. We go down here, we go back to our 2022, and we do educational services. Now, as she mentioned, they don't only serve public libraries and school libraries, they also serve the academic libraries. That's people like me, right? I'm a business librarian and I work with at a R1 research university. So there I am, which is why this is right here. So now we've been able to say the majority of people are working within the industries. We say this is definitely a representation of this market because they're working in the correct industry. And now we have to defend that it's actually in Ohio. So 84% in Ohio, pretty good. The rest of them, right? What are these? What is Mountain, South Atlantic? Well, again, the census provides us clarification. We click on their actual definitions of it, and there we go. East, North, South Atlantic, Middle Atlantic, right? These are the different sections. Mountain, right? This is what they were describing. So if we look at this, we can easily tell that they don't even have enough of each of these regions to pull them out for one state. This is a good usable tool to size the market and to define the market. Anyway, so really, really, really useful and really, really cool tool. I also want to point out if you work with career services, you want to work with career services in academia, if you want to run programs for people thinking of going to college or who have degrees but are trying to find new jobs, this is a really cool tool if your institutions or your states are included because it can give people ideas of not only where they're working, where they want to work, what salaries they should be expecting, but also what industries they might be working in. So, a lot of students really love this tool. But a more easy to defend argument, again, I think that one's pretty, once you understand what it's saying, it's really easy to defend. But an even easier one is going to be your ONET data because it uses Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and it's going to allow access to national, state, and local salary data through this beautiful tool, right? Seems unassuming. All you need to do is type in librarian in media collection specialists. We click on this. Beautiful. Now, I would like to point out, just like with the last tool, we were defending that people with MLS degrees actually have or are working in libraries, which is important. In the same way, we need to ponder what a media collection specialist is and think about that. Keep that in the back of your brain. It'll come up later during the presentation. But notice it says librarians and media collection specialists. It'll give you a bunch of cool stuff like tasks, technology, work activities, but not what we're focusing on. What we're focusing on right now is wages, right? 45056 is, I think, near Oxford. It might be the Hamilton area, but anyway, it's around that region, and you'll see why it doesn't really matter in a second. You choose the zip code and look at this, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about cost of living, but if you pair cost of living stuff and understanding how expensive areas are with this data, you'll have a much better ability to negotiate, and you'll have a much more beautiful and coherent narrative. But I'd like to point out here that just like with the last one, with the 1, the 5, and the 10 years, we are also getting good information about experience levels, right? Let's say Cincinnati, that's actually where that's going to be because Miami University is in Oxford. So the closest thing we have is Cincinnati. It's not perfect, but it's what we have. It's at 40,000, 48,000, and at 61,000. This tells us that something like, let's say, you're new to the field and you are a liaison librarian or something like that. A $50,000 salary in this area is not particularly lowballed for an entry level librarian. Now, that's my personal opinion, but okay, so I'm going to argue in this point because it's at the 25% quartile, right? You still have a bunch to learn, you still have a bunch of training, and they're also giving you what's the what? I guess they're rolling the dice on you, they're gambling on you. So they have a good argument for having somewhere between here and here. Somebody who is at 5 or 6 years, like myself, and is specialized in a specific field, 61,000 to 76,000 would be much more reasonable because you could argue with through your work and everything you've done that you actually have are at least half as good as any of the librarians that are going to be in there, right? So you'd be able to use this number. But okay, so the local data is going to be important for this because state data is not going to take effect of the higher salaries in cities or the lower salaries in more rural areas. And when you're in a salary negotiation, most people will have a conversation about that. If they're trying to say, hey, no, we can't go that high for XYZ, it's almost always about, it's not as expensive as this specific state data or the state number you're actually quoting. So the local data helps a lot with that, but it's not perfect, but we can make it better by looking at the industry specializations through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Like I mentioned earlier, well, I didn't mention it earlier, but it's good to know that different industries have varying salaries. Academic librarians, school librarians, media specialists, which is what I was referring to when I said mentioned it earlier, will have different starting salaries. So that the national thing, and then the state, and then the local data will give you information, but they're not going to be perfect, right? The local can even be misleading if you're entering a lower or higher industry. So we can actually create an industry multiplier right here. It sounds a lot more confusing than it is. Not as confusing as it's going to look. But you basically take the industry mean wage, divide it by the average librarian wage, and it creates your multiplier, right? So, for my example, I work in academia, always have, and I probably won't leave it. College, university, and professional schools divided by the average librarian salary. These are the numbers, and it'll give me 1.07. But don't take my word for it. We're actually going to go into the BLS data to prove it, right? Um, this is a little outdated, but we're not using this data to argue for the wage. We're using this data to argue for the multiplier. So I don't mind it being a little outdated, 3 or 4 years to use it for this, because it's really more about the trend of what industry tends to make a little bit more money. That's not wildly going to change within 2 or 3 years. It takes a little bit for that to change. So there's that mean annual wage we were talking about, right? And remember how I said library and media specialists or just media specialists? Look at this. $60,000 versus $73,000. So if we weren't using this multiplier, it would be wildly changed the salary of those local ones by the mean annual wage, right? So this is pulling it down really heavily, and that local data is pulled down quite a bit, most likely. So once we are able to understand that and apply the multiplier, which is what we're doing right, well, I pushed the wrong button. 1 second. Right here, we get, let me pull up a calculator and pull it over here. Okay, we get, oh goodness, what was it? Local wages, 61700. Six up, did the wrong one. 61700 times 1.07. And we have a prediction of a salary we should actually be getting based on the industry multiplier, right? And we're going to be able to do that in the workshop if you're interested. But yeah, I would then argue that this is a much more reasonable one than that mean that we saw at the local scale because so many of these are pulling the average salary down. Anyway, next is real public salary websites, right? So the ones we were looking at before, they're good. They're good for you defining your market, but they're not infallible, right? Having the degree, that's great, but they could still argue against it. Having local data, again, really good, harder to argue against, but still you can argue against it. You can't argue against real public salary website, real public salary data because it's literally what they were paying them. They were literally paying these people this amount of money. So you have a much, 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 much better narrative and a much more convincing argument if you can find this information. And you usually can, well, you can always find academic ones. You usually can find public ones. And I've had a tiny bit of hard time finding the school librarian ones, but I'm sure we can find it in the workshop. But the most popular one for Ohio is going to be called the Buckeye Institute. All we'd have to do is do higher ed salary, right? It's K-12, local higher ed. Here I am, and I'm just gonna do Zach, see how it goes. Voila. Now, I want to be very clear. I actually earned more than this. Miami University is a wonderful university. They did not just pay me $10,000. I ended up getting there in like November. So that's what's reflected right here. But what we do right here is let's say you're trying to apply for the business librarian position over there. You would then try to find who the last business librarian was and find that information about how much they did. You then could add during the interview, something you should always ask if it's going really well and you think you have a chance of getting the job is what do raises look like? 2%, 3%. And then literally you can get a very, very close number because you'll have the actual reported salary here. And then you can add 3%, 3%, 3%. And if it's a lot lower, then you could just ask, very kindly, well, it seems like your last librarian was making about this amount of money. Why wouldn't I be getting that amount of money? And if they have a good reason, that's fine. But usually, it's very hard to argue if you have the same amount of experience, the same skills, and you can do the same thing, that you shouldn't be making as much as the last person they were paying, especially because with inflation, and I mean, that's just how it goes. Every single year, jobs are getting not more lucrative. That's you really can't tie that to librarianship, but people tend to make more every single year. That being said, I really don't like this website as much. It's a good one and it's the most popular one, so I wanted to let everyone know it exists. But I actually prefer the Gov salaries, right? Because this one focuses on Ohio. The national one, Gov salaries, and this is useful for people who, like me, like exploring the world and working in different regions of the United States of America. And it has easier filters. You can type in librarian. I want to be very clear. Do not type in this librarian media specialist. It confuses the crap out of it. Basic is better in these. You click on librarian and it'll give you the state. We're going to use Ohio. And it'll give you all the people who are librarians and who they're employed by. Now, the reason we're doing this is because it can be very hard to figure out what the employer is defined as in these kinds of tools. So instead, what we're doing is we're using a job, we're figuring out who the employer is. And by the way, amazing academic, special libraries. Oh, goodness. Public libraries. It's really cool. But let's just say we're interviewing at Stark County. We click on this. We go back to our home. We toss in employer, Stark County Library District, and now we have really up-to-date information on all the different jobs. Apologies for not actually going into the salary details. These people haven't consented to show that type of information, so I'm not going to put it on a recording. But you can actually access all their different salaries and a lot of information about what they do. Well, not as much as you could in other avenues, but the salary details are really important right here. And then you can use it for your own negotiations. Anyway, cool tool. Finally, when you're talking about gathering the data, those are what I like to call deserve arguments, and they can sound rude and they can sound pretentious and they can quickly make people against you and not like you. So always be very polite and make sure you're saying it in a correct way, right? Not, yeah, because again, I've seen some people fail at interviews because they put those arguments in a less than palatable way is a good way to put it. These are really, really, really easy to make because I like to call them the needs argument. Librarians tend to be very nurturing. We help support, I would argue, a better world. That's what libraries are all about. So the need argument, saying, well, I need this to live in this area or I need this to survive in it, works really, really well, at least in my experience. And the two easiest ones are going to be your cost of living and actually comparing who you're going to be competing with housing and stuff like that. Um, you can go to the cost of living calculator. There's a bunch of these. I like NerdWallet as well because it calculates it a little bit differently. But my favorite one is Forbes. You then can choose where you're going here, right? You can go, who cares? Sure, we'll do from Mississippi or something. We'll do MS. Doesn't really matter where we're living. Let's say the job offer was because we were talking about it earlier, 53, and we already make 50,000 in Jackson, Mississippi, and we're going to Cincinnati. Okay. Now we have an extremely good argument saying that let's say if the job offer was 53,000 and you are already making 50,000, they're offering you $300 a year more to come work for them. That's nobody would find that acceptable. So once you start having these conversations and saying, well, I'm already technically making that amount of money, right? So if y'all wanted me to go over there, it would have to be for $5,000, $6,000, whatever you decide extra, because technically with my salary, I'm already making this amount of money, right? If they want to be competitive in the market and have you leave an already place where you're doing well, they're going to have to do more. So that's a really easy way to be able to argue your point is using cost of living. And the second one, and one of my favorites, is looking at housing markets. Not in a really confusing and difficult way, but instead going, how much are the people in this area making, and will I be able to compete for housing there? because for a middle class, which is what most librarians are, having housing or something like that tends to be the quickest way that we generate wealth and actually create a better world for ourselves, is being able to afford housing. It's one of the big ticket items. And even if it's just rent, it's a bigger ticket item. You go down here, again, we're using the census, but these are just quick profiles. We look at our median household income, $40,000. So this is actually kind of a really very librarian thing that's about to happen right now. This is a trick. $40,000, 764, and assess your data, right? So this looks really, really good on paper, right? And you might be like, oh my God, 53,000 when people only making $40,000 a year. Let's jump at the deal. But if we go, right, assess your data to another tool that uses census data, we see the median age, right? So if something looks too perfect to be true, we then can go and see that they're actually including students, or else this wouldn't be a thing, right? 21.1% is the median age. And if you don't believe that, then you can also go down here to rent. Nope, that's the wrong button. Here we go. Renter occupied, right? So it's saying this is a heavily rent college area, which means these numbers are very, very, very skewed. And thus, you can actually use this data, but not specifically this one. You could look at census data and just look at the older populations that happen to live in the area, right? But this is a trick. It's not an intentional trick, but yeah. Using this data, though, you could figure out that most people make like 70,000 or 65,000. And once you understand, like, for example, if you make 45,000 and everyone else makes 65,000, you're just not going to have that fun of a life just because everything's going to be acclimating to that level of income. Oh, beautiful. But anyway, yeah, so you can access all that data. And if anyone wants to know, I can show you how. Finally, we've talked about a really, really important part of salary negotiation. It's basically being able to back up your narrative with facts, which is this little section called data that I call data. But if you look over here on this nice little chart, I almost called it a pie graph, pie chart, you see that what I like to call power makes up more than 60%. This little pie, ch pie chart, it's not super specific. I didn't mean this as saying this is scientifically correct. What I mean is that if you don't have any power in your negotiation, it doesn't matter how much information you know. It doesn't matter how much you like, how much they like you. If you have no power to negotiate, you're not going to be able to increase your salary. So that is something that's very important to know, and it's something to think about before you go into any interview. Is Right. And these are the things how I define it. There's a few more, but these are simple ones, right? How important is that role to your institution? And by that, I mean, if somebody does not fill this role, will it become crashing down? Can they cut it, right? If the price of your salary gets too high, are there any other individuals who could easily step into that role? What I mean by that is, are you super specialized and you have a bunch of knowledge about a really, really, really important aspect of that university, like a specific database or a specific library circulation system or something like that? Are they even able to negotiate on price? This is super important. A lot of government libraries at the national level literally can't. Unions sometimes don't allow you to negotiate on price. Yeah, sometimes you just have no power because it's how the pay structure actually works. Could you easily get another position, right? Is your skill level enough to where you'd have three or four other libraries interested in you? If so, then even if they say, no, we're not interested, you could go and get more money elsewhere, right? Many times, this will actually allow you to say, well, I've been offered a position with X amount of salary, and they're willing to, because they're basically getting the market rate from you to push up your salary. And finally, this is, I think it's super important because if you're not willing to work in other regions, right? Are you willing to work in other regions, or are you stuck and only interested in your specific area? You're gonna have a much harder time with power, right? Because let's think about Mississippi. Let's say there's four universities. I don't know if this is true, and there's only four business librarian positions. Well, on the larger scale, there's like 50 or 55 in the United States of America. That means that there's a much larger market for me to enter there. If you're only staying in Mississippi, that there's only three or four other people to compete against, so they don't have to increase their price. So, anyway, can you prove your assertions? That's literally what we're doing, those 20%. And then, of course, I call it charisma. That's not really the best thing to call it, but I've never really thought about a really good thing to call it. But the idea is how much do they like you and do you fit the culture? And again, notice data and charisma are going to be less than power. And it really depends on the institution about the narrative. If you have a really good narrative, some people are more interested, or they don't really care about the narrative at all. They just think you'll fit into the culture. So the data and charisma section, I would argue, vary wildly. I mean, sometimes it's like 35-5. The other time it's the opposite. So, but the main thing about that graph is knowing power is the most important, and it is good to have the other two. So thanks for watching. Now I'm happy to take any questions about using any of these resources, salary negotiation, and if there's no questions,